Paul Treichler, son of an army doctor, moved around as a child and found himself at home in Massachusetts, China, the Philippines, Colorado, and Montana. At the University of Montana, while working on a double major in English and mathematics, he met and married Jessie Cameron, who was working on her undergraduate degree in English with a minor in history. After graduation, Paul continued on at U of M for a master's degree in English. Then, in 1932, the couple moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where Paul completed his studies at Yale University's Drama School, and where Jessie found employment as the drama school's librarian. At Yale, Paul studied playwriting under George Pierce Baker, who had earlier taught playwriting to George Abbott, Thomas Wolfe, and Eugene O'Neill. Then, in 1934, the Treichlers, ages 29 and 28, moved to Yellow Springs, Ohio, where Paul became Antioch College's first theater faculty, and where Jessie was hired as assistant to the president and would go on to become associate director of development. In that capacity, between 1936 and 1959, she would recruit for the college 150 African-American students, among them Coretta Scott, who would become Coretta Scott King, and Leon Higginbotham, who would go on to become the Chief Justice of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. When Paul arrived, theater was already a vigorous avocation at Antioch, involving students, faculty, and the broader community of Yellow Springs. According to 19th century Antioch professor James Kendall Hosmer, Antioch was the first college in America to include dramatics in its program. In an 1872 article in the Atlantic Monthly, he railed against academics who would chastise Antioch students and faculty for mounting a play at a collegiate event at Sweetbriar, Virginia. The only reason other colleges and universities weren't mounting plays, he protested, is because the strictest form of Puritanism stamped itself too powerfully upon our New England institutions at their foundation to make it possible that the drama should be anything but outlaw here. But what was outlawed elsewhere was at Antioch fodder for exploration. Antioch, a non-sectarian institution that allowed women and African Americans to enroll as students from its beginning, had been bucking convention since 1853. Yes, when the Treichlers arrived, theater was already an enthusiastic avocation. Paul was hired to turn that enthusiasm into an academic discipline. Treichler was an intellect of the first water, but there was nothing elitist about him. He was vigorous in his curiosities, and he was curious about everything and everyone. For Paul, plays were ideas made flesh to wrestle with in the trenches. His vision for Antioch was ambitious. He wanted to make quality theater as common as sidewalks. To that end, he devised a system. Every year the college would mount 4 plays, a classic, a musical or comedy, a popular play like a recent Broadway hit, and an original, experimental, or little-known play. In his first year at Antioch, Paul mounted plays in the Yellow Springs Opera House in the fall, winter, and spring. Beginning the summer of 1935, Antioch students Adna Carnes and Cleveland Gadge Thomas sublet the Opera House from the college and mounted Broadway comedies and a few original scripts. Summer theater thrived in the Opera House with many sold-out houses until 1941. During the Second World War, Paul kept the theater going with a reduced schedule and nearly all female casts. With many faculty engaged in the war effort, those faculty still on campus took up the slack. Between 1940 and 1945, in addition to teaching drama courses, Paul also taught composition, athletics, and mathematics. Arthur Lithgow was a sophomore at Antioch when Paul arrived. As a child, he'd lost his father and two siblings to the great flu epidemic. This made him, at the age of 4, the man of the family. His mother, with help from Boston Unitarians, turned their large house into a private nursing home. So Arthur grew up changing bedpans and bathing and feeding old people. His one escape was to steal away to the privacy of the attic and read Shakespeare. By the time he graduated high school, Arthur had read his way through the canon at least once. As a student at Antioch, he played Macbeth, Brutus, Petruchio, Hamlet in an unedited 4-hour production that Treichler directed, and Horace Mann in A Testament of Faith, a play Treichler had written about Horace Mann that follows Mann from his appointment as Secretary of Education in Massachusetts to the founding of Antioch College, with Horace Mann as its first president. It was at Antioch where Arthur fell in love and married fellow Antioch thespian Sally Price. After graduating, Arthur worked various professional theater gigs in New York, taught English and drama at the Putney School in Vermont, did war production work at Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York, and earned a master's degree in English from Cornell. Then, in the fall of 1947, at the age of 32, Arthur Lithgow returned to Antioch College as an associate professor of English. My father, Meredith Dallas, more commonly known as Dal, was paroled to Yellow Springs in 1945, after having spent a few years in prison as a conscientious objector. Similar to Arthur, my father, at the age of 6, found himself the oldest son in his family when his older brother Eric died of a staph infection. What it would mean to be the oldest son in this family was made clear a few years later when the minister of their church, the Honorable Lynn Harold Huff, came for Sunday brunch. When he left in his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, my father's father put his arm around his son and said to him, "That's what I want you to be when you grow up." As a Union seminarian in 1940, my father and 7 other Union seminarians refused to register for the draft. Had they registered as seminarians, they would have been exempt from service. It was the act of registration they were protesting. Their court case made the front page of the New York Times. The Union 8, as they were known, were sentenced to a year and a day in the Danbury, Connecticut Federal Penitentiary. There they found themselves in and out of solitary confinement for various acts of protest, fasting to integrate the segregated dining hall which they achieved, fasting to protest the sweatshop work conditions of the prison's industry, and fasting to protest one thing or another they found unjust in the prison. About a year and a half after my father was released, he was arrested for hitchhiking. Unbeknownst to the Union 8, the Danbury warden, upon their release, had registered them with their draft board. Because my father never showed up for induction, he was now in violation of the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. He was offered the option of going to a CO camp or into the military. He refused both options, so again he was sent off to prison. This time he found himself in a penitentiary in Ashland, Kentucky. He'd not been there long when he learned through my mother, Willa Winter Dallas, that other COs spread throughout the federal prison system were staging a hunger strike to break the censorship of the males. My father joined their effort and went 30 days without food. He finally quit the strike when he so emaciated his navel bulged out. He'd had enough. "I was getting really tired of that conscientious objector stance," he told me when I interviewed him in 1979. "I wanted to get rid of it and join the world." When he was paroled to Yellow Springs in 1945, where my mother and their first child, Berry, had established residence because of a peace conference there, he did join the world through Antioch Theatre Productions. Now he was no longer standing apart from the world, but caught up in its swirling embrace. He found the thing he wanted to do and could do. He found a forum through which he could express in body and voice ideas and observations of the world. So a year later, in 1946, the family left Yellow Springs for Cleveland, where my father enrolled in a graduate program in theater at Western Reserve. Basil Langton, a guest artist who arrived at Western Reserve from England in 1947, opened my father's eyes to the possibility of a meaningful career in theater. Basil, who like my father was a conscientious objector, had got his training as an apprentice actor at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon. We had 5 weeks of rehearsal to prepare 7 plays, he wrote in his memoir, The War Years. To be an apprentice at Stratford in 1934 was the last opportunity for a young actor to work with some of the great Shakespearean actors of the last century, actors who had worked with Henry Irving, Ellen Terry, B. Bomtree, Forbes Robertson, John Martin Harvey, and Frank Benson. Benson, who Basil met in the waning hours of Benson's life, had, as an actor-manager, toured with his company for 40 years. With 3 weeks of rehearsal, they would mount 15 plays. Having started at Stratford in 1886, Benson had acted with Henry Irving. An actor in Irving's company had acted with Edmund Kean. In Kean's company there were actors who had worked with Garrick. Fellow actors with Garrick had acted with Betterton, who had actors that had played in the Blackfriars and the Globe, where Burbage first acted the plays of Shakespeare. For my father, Basil's arrival to the Dolesville of Western Reserve was like a sustaining wind to a schooner long stalled on a calm sea. I recognized his excellence, my father told me, and I was challenged to move with it. In 1948, a job opened at Antioch teaching public speaking. My father applied for the job and was hired. So my parents returned to Yellow Springs, and my father, now 31, taught public speaking at Antioch and did speech checks on all the students. But his main interest, and where he spent much of his time, was doing theater, acting and directing at the Opera House. At least he acted and directed at the Opera House for a year. For in 1949, Greene County building inspectors closed the Opera House because it was deemed structurally unsound. Everyone knew it was sound as bedrock, that the real problem wasn't structural but neighbors complaining about noise. So until Antioch Theatre could find a permanent home, they found themselves operating hither and yon, on an extended stage in the town's movie house, in the women's gymnasium at Antioch, on the small proscenium stage in the Dayton Art Institute, and on at least one occasion off the front steps of Antioch's main building. Still, even with limited venues on which to perform, between the closing of the Opera House in 1949 and 1951, Antioch managed to mount over 30 productions, including The Taming of the Shrew, St. Joan, The Mad Woman of Chaillot, The Barber of Seville, and Much Ado About Nothing. In 1951, Arthur Lithgow, my father, and Basil performed and directed a series of plays by George Bernard Shaw on Martha's Vineyard. Shaw, seafood, salt winds blowing off the Atlantic. It was heaven, my father said. Lithgow was so taken with the place, he and his wife Sally, on a whim, bought a house on the island. It must have been the fall of that year, my father and Arthur still high from that summer of Shaw plays on Martha's Vineyard, when Arthur took my father out to what was then called Front Campus, the large, expansive lawn that stretches between Corey Street and Antioch's main building. Looking up at that castle-like facade designed by Alpheus Marshall Merrifield, Arthur, with his trademark twinkle in his eye, asked my father if he could imagine all of Shakespeare's chronicle plays performed in historical sequence off the main building's front steps. While my father wasn't sure what to make of Arthur's vision, it was clear to him it was a vision, and a vision that had for some time been brewing in his head. Then in the summer of '52, my father found himself with Arthur, co-directors of Antioch Shakespeare Under the Stars, smack in the thick of that vision, which over the course of the summer became increasingly, exhilaratingly, and finally exhaustingly real. Bud Steinhilber, a graphic artist with V Design Studios who had previously designed sets for more than 30 Antioch productions and was known to audiences in the area as a marvelous comedic actor, designed a stage with 7 levels, including an inner above and an inner below that could effectively be used by all the plays. There would be 28 actors, some professionals from New York under special contract or with Actors' Equity, as they'd be working below scale, others with professional experience from the area, plus Antioch students, faculty, and villagers. This would be the first time in the United States that Shakespeare's history plays would be performed in repertory. The idea was novel and ambitious. But novelty and ambition were no guarantees the plays would bring in crowds. As Dorothy Lamming, a local and fine actress with the company, wrote in her Ph.D. dissertation, according to Brooks Atkinson, New York Times theater reviewer and Antioch board member, the Chronicle plays had a 300-year popularity rating about equal to that of Typhoid Annie. And this was not London or Stratford, not even New York or Chicago. This was a sleepy college town of 2,500 snug in the hinterlands of Ohio, and the interstate highways had not yet been built. The festival opened with King John, in which my father had a small role. Attendance for the opening matinee was 27. This prompted one of the actors to ask, did they still have to perform if the cast outnumbered the audience? An unwritten rule was devised. If there were at least 25 people in the audience by curtain time, the play would go on. Attendance grew slowly but steadily over the course of the summer. A week later, they opened King Richard II. My father played Richard, and in the actor-manager tradition, he also directed the play. Lithgow played his adversary, Henry Bolingbroke. Halfway through the second week, they ran King John and King Richard II in repertory. The third week opened with King Henry IV, Part 1, with Lithgow continuing with Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, my father playing Hotspur to David Hook's Prince Hal, and Arthur Ocelog taking on the massive mantle of the fat, jolly, philosophical knight, Falstaff. Halfway through the third week, they alternated the 3 plays nightly, with matinee and evening performances on Saturday and Sundays. The schedule was so tight, with rehearsals during the day and performances at night, the only available time to work technical rehearsals with lights rigged on metal scaffolding, was after performance Sunday night. After a rain from the weight of the lights, the front legs of the scaffolding would dig into the earth and lean forward, causing what actors and crew called crotch focus. These technical rehearsals tended to run until the sun rose, obliterating the possibility of distinguishing stage from natural light. It was at this time they ran out of money. Antioch was between presidents, so the question of what to do fell on the shoulders of acting president, dean of faculty Boyd Alexander. This was the time of the Red Scare. There was this fellow, Harvey Matusow, who in 1952, according to Antioch College historian and archivist Scott Sanders, began his new career as a professional red-sniffing, whistle-blowing squealer, a job description couched as research assistant for the Ohio Un-American Activities Commission. Because Matusow had years earlier been a member of the American Communist Party, the commission regarded him as an expert on Communist front groups, especially youth-oriented ones. Antioch Matusow told the commission was a hotbed of communists. If they had doubts, Matusow had numbers to prove it. 6% of Antioch's 1,200 students, he told them, were card-carrying members of the Youth Progressives of America, a group already recognized by the commission as a Communist Front organization. All this red-baiting hullabaloo caused distress for a number of Antioch faculty, students, and townspeople, and the theater faculty came under particular scrutiny over a rumor that Russian tea had been served at one of their parties. Matusow's findings were, of course, completely trumped up. His investigation consisted of nothing more than hanging out for a couple of days at Ye Old Trail Tavern, a downtown eatery. But his red-baiting had whipped up a bunch of bad press for the college. In contrast, Shakespeare Under the Stars had been nothing but good press that was not only local but statewide and national. With Brooks Atkinson on the college board, news of the festival had made the New York Times. So with an eye to saving the college from bad press, Alexander, who was also a strong supporter of Antioch Theatre, agreed to chip in however much would be needed to see the season through. Week 4 opened with King Henry IV, Part 2. Henry V opened the following week. My father directed and played the Duke of Exeter. The 6th week opened with King Henry VI. Arthur had combined the 3 Henry VI plays into one, resulting in a narrative that was, reportedly, confusing not only for audiences, but for the actors as well. Then came Richard III. My father played Buckingham to Alan Rich's Richard. The schedule had been so taxing, with the same actors taking on different roles play after play. By opening night, Rich had been unable to memorize all his lines, so he carried his script halfway through the week. By now it seemed the whole town was involved. On stage, backstage, working concessions, sitting in the audience show after show. Children were following the actors as if they were movie idols in a cliff-hanging franchise. Workmen who during the day were digging a ditch and laying pipe within shouting distance of the stage would sometimes corner an actor to ask him or her about their character or a particular moment in a scene. It turned out, after hours on their own time, the workmen were gathering with their foremen, who would read the plays aloud to them. Theater-goers were now flocking to the festival, not only from all corners of Ohio, but from neighboring states as well. Kentucky, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Michigan, Indiana, New York, and from states even further afield. And they tended to come not just for one play, but return again and again until they'd taken in the entire cycle. One New York tugboat captain, whose boat was owned by the New York Central train line, and whose trains ran through Springfield 10 miles up the road, would take a sleeper with his wife once a month after work on Fridays, get picked up by someone from the festival Saturday morning, see 4 plays over the weekend, then he and his wife would grab a sleeper Sunday night back to New York, where they'd arrive in time for work Monday morning. Finally, the last play of the festival arrived, King Henry VIII, which my father directed and played Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Arthur Lithgow played King Henry VIII. Since they were now selling out night after night, they decided to add 200 seats and boost capacity to 950, with SRO bumping it up to 1,000. For the final week of the festival, they ran all 8 plays in repertory, 7 nights a week, a different play each night, 4 plays on the weekend. My father said by the close of the season he was afraid to tilt his head for fear all his lines would fall out. For the final performance of Henry VIII, which ends with Archbishop Cranmer christening the child that would become Queen Elizabeth, a part played by my best friend through childhood, Nick Dewey, who had been born in March of that year, my father thought sending Roman candles up from either side of the stage would be the appropriate, glorious closing to the season. 2 Antioch students who had been around during the summer were employed to launch the Roman candles. The first Roman candle, instead of shooting up into the air, flew like an artillery missile across the stage, barely missing the cast which had been assembled for the christening. Thankfully, it gained enough altitude to zip above the heads of the audience. My father at this point was hoping against hope the second student would not launch the second Roman candle, but the thought had barely gelled in his head before the second Roman candle whistled across the stage from the opposite direction and landed in a woman's lap, burning off her dress and causing serious burns. For the rest of the night my father sat by her bedside in the college infirmary, doing all he could to soothe her shattered nerves so she wouldn't sue the college. The 2 students who had lit the fireworks, who later claimed the fiasco was not their fault, that the Roman candles had been stuck crookedly in the ground, left early the following morning for co-op jobs. But the festival had been a rousing success. Not only had they presented all of Shakespeare's history plays, shot them out as quickly as sitcoms, then run them in repertory, they'd also accomplished what is almost unheard of in the theater world. They ended the season in the black. Even with Harvey Matusow fanning the flames of the Red Scare, the college recouped its entire investment. The newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II sent the company a congratulatory letter, and folks from the town of Stratford in Canada, who were planning to start their own Shakespeare festival the following year, popped down to Yellow Springs to see how it might be done. And on campus, among the students, Treichler, Lithgow, and Dallas took on the collective moniker of the triumvirate. Lithgow's vision to mount all of Shakespeare's history plays had been realized. Since the season had gone so swimmingly well, the next step seemed obvious. Keep it going. So, over the next 4 summers, they mounted every play Shakespeare had written, even those few plays whose authorships were in doubt.